G'day, Professor Joseph Drew. It's that time of the year when I forecast the big issues for local government. And in this video, I go through 5 really important issues. And they're really important to all decision makers, to your executives, to your directors, and particularly your councillors. I encourage you to play this video in your workshop. It's under my name. It's my personal property, and I'm happy for you to use it in any way that helps others. I encourage you to air these issues and risks and problems and obstacles with your communities and your broader staff. Please help me to help others. So what will be the issues, the big issues for 2024? I list 4 in this video. The first one's inflation. It hasn't gone anywhere. Okay, I know we've got disinflation. Inflation is reducing, but it's still incredibly high, 4.5%. And there's no good reason to continue thinking that's going to continue decreasing at the rate that we've seen in the past. It's what's called base effects. When you're comparing inflation from one period to another, if the period you compared it to was very high, it's easy to show a good improvement. But now, if you cast your mind back, we're comparing things to 12 months ago when things weren't quite as high as what they were the previous 12 months. So it's going to be much harder to have the sorts of gains that we had over the last 12 months. Besides, the inflationary factors are still, for the most part, there. We have the green revolution. Okay, in time, it might reduce the price of energy. But at the moment, we've got to build these windmills and hydro plants and solar farms, and that's costing huge amounts of capital, and that will be passed on. And there's no guarantee that when the capital costs reduce, that those will be passed on. Now, we've got the incredible reduction in productivity that happened as a result of COVID. People were told they were non-essential workers, and were shown that they could simply cease to exist as employees anytime a shock arose. And that's reduced people's incentive to put their whole heart, mind and soul into the job. Now, I know for a fact that my job consumes me 24/7. If I felt that my employer would just give me the flick when it suited, I might be less inclined to do that extra work, to do the 11-hour days that I do each and every day. And also working from home, whether we like it or not. No, there's lots of advocates of it, and I work from home myself and have done for many years. But most people will be less productive at home as they will be in the office. Moreover, you don't get that networking and that culture building at home that you get in the office. And we're going to see the effect of that into the future as new employees come in and aren't exposed to networks and culture building. A lot of people, if you can't afford to have your own office, I've built my own office here for my workplace, and you don't have a lot of self-discipline, you simply won't get as much work done. Now, lower productivity equals higher inflation, or other things held constant. We still have international turmoil. We still have friendshoring, which costs more money. There's a reason we sent everything to China in the first place, because it was cheaper. We have the potential for more conflicts. There's conflicts going on already that are inflationary. Ukraine, it has an inflationary effect, particularly on food and gas and oil and aluminium. We have the Middle East. That will have an inflationary effect, particularly on fuel if the war continues or is exacerbated. But you've got the tensions with Taiwan. If that blows up and gets stronger, there's going to be more trade sanctions from the US against China, China against US. There could be a complete disruption of trading. Any of those sanctions are going to increase costs. That's what tariffs do. That's what they're meant to do. So that's a very big inflationary factor. And then we have supply shocks. They're still here. I still regularly go to my shop and can't find bread and can't find other essentials. I'm trying to buy a new car, trade down because of my health, to a smaller car. and I've got to wait 3 months. None of that's been fixed since COVID. It's still a problem. There's something seriously wrong with our economy. Copper. Copper's a prime example. AAL's announced that they will be producing less copper. There's a copper squeeze going on. And if you think about everything that has copper in it, electrics, vehicles, all this green revolution stuff, it's dependent on copper. It's called Dr. Copper for a good reason. And the price, if there's a price squeeze, the price will be going up, and that will have an inflationary effect. It's harder to build new mines these days because of environmental regulations and government reticence to open new mines, and that has inflationary effects. At the end of the day, what we did is we crushed productivity and we created new money supply. That's what Zimbabwe did. That's what Germany did. That's what they did in England in the barber boom. And that has effects. We haven't felt the effects yet. But if you look at other places where they did these things, it was several years after. So the idea that inflation's gone away, I think, is wrong. Will it continue decreasing? Perhaps. Could it jump up again and bite us? I think that's a reasonable possibility. I think this year will be a year of even greater emphasis on financial sustainability. One of the things that worries me about financial sustainability is people struggle to define it. I've got a video on this, but I'm thinking of updating it because I've been thinking about it more. Indeed, I'm thinking about contracting to write another book. Yeah, I know every time I say it's my last book, because it is a really hard thing to write a book, but I want to write one more book on making local government sustainable because it is such a huge issue. And we haven't even properly defined what is sustainability. See, the problem with government, unlike your personal finances, is that you can rack up a debt and leave it to another generation. Not just explicit debt, like a debt from a bank, but also implicit debt, not doing things that you know you should do. Now, I can't do that in my private life. I can't rack up a debt to go to Japan to watch the sumo and say, here you go, Tom, you're paying that debt. It doesn't work like that. It's not possible legally, but governments can. If I don't do maintenance on my house and there's a big catastrophe because of it and a big expense down the track, I bear the cost. But when governments don't do that maintenance, a future generation bears the cost, perhaps a generation that's not even born. And this brings me to the topic of that second picture. It's really in line, and this is what I want to develop in my next book, this idea of mob tyranny, the potential for mob tyranny. I'm not saying we're doing it. I'm saying there is a strong potential for it in government, where this generation can get everything they want and force a future generation to pay for it. And that's a really big problem. It's a problem I want to redress or help to redress before I retire in a few years. So I think another book's coming called Making Local Government Sustainable. And it's also something I want to redress in some short courses, which I hope to do this year through University in Newcastle, where I now work happily. I think it's time that we have some workshops that are run by people with a lot of expertise and a lot of scholarly knowledge. It won't just be me. I'll be using some of my esteemed colleagues from overseas to present at these things. And I would like us to get councillors and GMs and directors and even perhaps community members all in the same room talking about this and fleshing out the issue and what does it mean and what does it practically involve us doing. I would love our state governments and our regulators to be involved in those sorts of courses and that sort of discussion, because I think the big thing that's missing, there's going to be a lot of pressure on you to be financially sustainable. The big thing that's missing is clear guidelines about exactly what that means and what it looks like and how we get there. And that's something I want to redress in my books and my short courses this year. Third, and related to the first topic of inflation, capacity to pay is going to be a bigger issue this year. It's going to come up a lot more in the media. There's a lot more local governments having to go for special rate increases in the rate capping states in New South Wales and Victoria, because the effect of rate capping builds up over many years, and then what happens is you have to have a big tax increase to ensure some semblance of sustainability. That's what rate capping does. It keeps revenue low, but unfortunately doesn't do much about expenditure. The gap builds up over time, and then we've got to go for a very big increase. Now, every time that's going to happen, that's going to be in the media. So it's going to be an issue. State governments are going to feel the pressure of that. They're going to pass it back down to you. Just putting up rates by rate capping on the states that aren't in the rate capping regimes, just putting up your rates by whatever you feel is the inflation effect on local governments, will cop attention this year. Now, what's interesting to me is that we actually have a precise way of measuring capacity to pay. I've demonstrated it many times. I've done it in special rate variations that I do for councils. Using the econometrics, we can work out the capacity of a community to pay a certain tax take. Now, how you distribute it is also important, and that's something I've helped many councils with. Now, ratepayers and taxpayers will always say they can't afford a tax increase, but they will also demand things. It's natural human behavior to try to avoid paying tax and trying to avoid paying the full price for the things you consume. So we need a precise mathematical scientific way of determining what a reasonable tax capacity is, and as I said in previous videos, I've shown how this should be done. I've done this many times for councils, and I'm happy to help others with it should they feel that I can be of assistance. Now, before I get into the last two focus points for 2024, which are incredibly important, so please hang on. Look, take a moment to pause. Are these videos helping you? Would it be good if communities and decision makers had good, reliable information? Would it be good if communities and decision makers knew about scholarly research that was coming out and busting myths, such as the population growth myth that I've recently done in my work? If you want this sort of stuff happening, you need to support me. It's as simple as that. I can't do it all by myself. So it's really simple for you. Just subscribe and send the video to a couple of your mates who you think might get some value out of it. All I want to do is help others. I want what you want. The best, strongest local government sector that we can have in Australia. So please help me by helping others, by subscribing and flicking the video to someone else. I think debt capacity is going to be a big issue this year too. No state in Australia is measuring it properly for local governments. I've shown that there's an econometric method for this. I'm pretty sure I've got a video about that too. We can measure it quite precisely. And what the concern is that we could have councils taking on more debt than they have the capacity to pay. That has happened in the past. We've had councils go into administration because of it. So it's a real risk. It's not something I'm imagining. Now, what happens as you take on more and more debt is it takes up more and more of your budget, and eventually repaying the debt, particularly repaying the cost of debt, interest, is starting to eat into your ability to perform your responsibilities, and that's a real concern. So we need to start measuring precisely, and as I said, I can do this for you. I also want people to think about what's happening in debt rates. So there's a lot of hysteria about how cash rate is suddenly going to be reduced by all the central banks by a lot this year, and it's been factored into the stock markets, and they're going off shooting for the moon. But you need to understand the issue fully. First of all, why would central banks reduce the cash rate? It's going to stimulate the economy, it's going to increase demand, and therefore be an inflationary pressure. So until they're absolutely certain inflation's done and dusted, that won't be happening. They're not going to make the mistakes that were made in the past. But there's no payoff for reducing rates. There's that risk that you can stimulate inflation, that you can heat up the economy too much. Where's the advantage? It only becomes realistic and feasible and necessary if the economy is struggling. So all those people out there wishing for lots and lots of interest rate cuts this year, what you're really wishing for is an economy that's going splat, because that's why you would do it. There's no other good reason for central banks to reduce rates, and in fact there's a lot of risks involved in it. But it's not even that simple anyway, because the cash rates doesn't doesn't tell the whole story about the retail price of debt. Now, there's two sides of the equation. How much debt is being issued, and do we have willing buyers that want to buy the debt for that price? Or are they alarmed about the risk of how much debt is being issued? Or do they have better alternatives elsewhere, say in the equity market? We've got a lot of countries, particularly notably the US, who are issuing an awful lot of debt at the moment. They haven't struggled to find buyers yet, but they will eventually. Obviously, there's a limit to how many buyers are out there for debt. China's not buying as much debt as they did in the past. We've got countries that are still expanding their balance sheet, including us. So the idea that the cash rate will be reduced because inflation's under control, I'm not sure that that bears close scrutiny, that other things have to happen. But the idea that that automatically will reduce the cost of your debt, I think, is also optimistic. I think people are just being far too optimistic about this. I'd like you to be a lot more realistic about the price of debt. There's been a big reduction in the price of debt of late in anticipation of all this. But perhaps they've priced it all in already, and I perhaps have been overly optimistic. Time will tell. But be alert to the fact that the cost of debt isn't necessarily going to reduce significantly in the future. It could even increase. There's a lot of bond traders out there who are banking on an increase to the price of debt. Perhaps they're wrong. As I say, time will tell. I think this last one's your biggest risk, and I'm not sure everyone's alert to it. Budget constraints for your higher tiers of government, your state governments and your federal governments, are going to bite this year, and they're going to bite you hard. Now, it wasn't that many years ago that we had the FAG grant freeze. You've already seen in Victoria, they've got the new COVID levy, a new land tax, as I understand it. Now, that's competing with local government for their tax base. That's going to be a problem. I think all these huge flows of grants that we had around the time of COVID are going to start drying up. And I think there's even a potential for our grant regimes to be reduced or frozen, or certainly manipulated. See, the fact of the matter is that state governments have their own budget predicament, probably a bigger predicament than most local governments. And the federal government's looking at deficits as far as I can see. Okay, I know we accidentally got a surplus this time, but had more to do with the vagaries of the iron price than any good management or any structural goodness in our budget. So where will they turn? They can cop the blame and the media attention for having deficits, or they can turn to reducing their costs and passing some blame on to some others. And guess who is the target? The same target we always have, local government. Cost shifting, reducing grant flows, freezing grants, they're all possibilities. They hurt local government, but often state governments and federal governments, no one even really notices it because no one understands the importance of grant systems in the wider citizenry. And some people even support it. So I think that local government on the whole is being nowhere near as alert as they should be to the fact that these extraordinary grant flows we've had in the last few years, in all likelihood, I really can't see them continuing. I can see them drying up, tightening up, perhaps being frozen. And I would encourage you to factor that in to your long-term financial plans. Look, I hope this video has been helpful. I hope it's put out a lot of new ideas and made you think about the troubles and trials and the difficulties and obstacles that we'll have this year. I think it's going to be a difficult year. I think 2025 is going to be really crunch time. And I'd encourage you to set yourself up for the new year by thinking about these things, by factoring them into your forward planning, and help me to help others by getting this message out. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.